The brand new RTX 3060 has arrived, which raises the question, should you buy a 3060 or what about a 3060 Ti or heck, maybe even an RTX 3070? In this video, I'm going to be comparing all those cards, and I've also thrown in a 6800 from AMD and of course Nvidia's very own RTX 3080 Founders Edition for good measure. I've got my iPad alongside literally hundreds of different gaming benchmarks that we've ran on all of these cards to really kind of advise you guys what the best options to buy in 2021 are. I want to preface this video as well by saying that all these cards are loan samples that have to go back, and we've got them in specifically because we wanted to make this video. So when the stock is a bit better, you guys can really make an informed buying decision as to which is the card for you. Now let's kick things off by looking at Apex Legends, and then we'll move on to DLSS and ray tracing titles a little bit later. In our testing of Apex Legends, the 3060, 3060 Ti, and even the 3070 came really close to one another. At 1080p high settings, they all hovered in the region of 160 FPS on average, with our frame rate set to unlimited in the Origin game launcher, while the 6800 pulled a particularly strong lead at over 220 frames per second, and the 3080 even further ahead at 265. This kind of lines up with the card's recommended retail prices, though it's interesting to see just how close the 3060, 60 Ti, and 70 were. It's also worth noting that the 3060 had around a 36 FPS increase over the 2060 from last generation, which is obviously overwhelmingly positive. Now jumping up to 1440p, and we actually kind of see some pretty similar results. The 3060 Ti this time takes a bit of a lead over the 3060, around 30 FPS. But as I've mentioned in my 3060 Ti build videos, it's very close to the 3080. This is ASUS's tough model for anybody wondering. Once again, the 6800 and the RTX 3080 both pull out a strong lead. The 6800 is notably impressive when it comes to straight rasterization with no ray tracing or DLSS, and actually gives you nearly 30 FPS more than the 3070. And while it is more expensive, that's quite a big jump to really consider. Next up is Call of Duty's Black Ops Cold War, and here we saw some really interesting results. This game actually supports Nvidia's DLSS technology, which is an AI-backed resolution scaler that actually keeps much of the visual fidelity of a higher resolution but gives you the frame rate of a lower res. And this is a game where the 6800 performs well but kind of gets drowned out. Using the 3070 with DLSS, and bearing in mind that this is a cheaper card than the 6800, actually gives you 6 more frames per second. Not a lot, but it definitely performed better than the 6800 utilizing that DLSS tech. Once again, the 60, 60 Ti, and especially the 70 were all pretty close together, though the 3060's budget price tag becomes visible with a few FPS less than its slightly bigger brothers. The next title we got some results for today is Cyberpunk, and for this one, given how many graphs we've got, I'm gonna have to bring the iPad a little bit closer. Now at 1080p medium settings without any ray tracing, which does give the 6800 the upper hand for a second, we saw some pretty standard results. The 3080 with DLSS beat out the 6800 as to be expected, and similarly to before, the 3060 Ti and 3070 were very close to one another. This 3070 is an absolute trooper, and these results were replicated across all the 3070 models we've tested as well. Once again, the 60 Ti provided a nice bump over the 3060, and the 2060 from last generation sits a whopping 27 FPS lower than our 3060 non-Ti from the Ampere lineup. But what about if you want to go up to 1440p medium settings, keeping ray tracing off for just a moment? And here the results are a bit all over the place, to be honest with you. Utilizing DLSS on a lower end card allows you to beat out the numbers without DLSS on a higher end card. So let me explain. A 3060 with DLSS beats out a 3060 Ti without, and a 3060 Ti with DLSS beats out a 3070 without. We did see though the 3070 pull a much bigger lead over its 60 Ti brother in this gaming benchmark. So where the two have been close, the 70's extra muscle really pays off in a game like Cyberpunk. Once again, the difference with and without DLSS is pretty staggering, but I'm happy to announce our 3080 utilizing that DLSS tech comes in supreme with 110 FPS at 1440p in Cyberpunk, which is actually kind of crazy when you think about it. But what if you want ray tracing on? So let's stick with 1440p medium settings, and here the 3070 and 3060 Ti are very close. We're seeing a pattern starting to emerge here. While the 3060 definitely sits below with around 9 FPS less than the 3060 Ti compared to just 2 between the 60 Ti and the 70. The next title we tried out today is Death Stranding, and interestingly here, DLSS doesn't have quite so much of an impact. The 2060 from last gen comes in bottom with under 100 frames per second, while while the new RTX 3060 has an 8 frames per second lead, which tips it over the 100 FPS mark. Utilizing DLSS gives you a nice frame rate boost, but doesn't quite get ahead of the next tier card. And the gap between the 3070 and 60 Ti is a bit more pronounced here, but still definitely the closest of any of the cards we tested today. Interestingly as well, the 6800 beats out the 3070 without DLSS, but can't quite compete when you throw DLSS into the equation, and the straight rasterization on this really quite heavy graphics card actually impresses me once again. I just wish AMD had an answer to DLSS, which they currently don't really. Next up is Fortnite, a favourite title of many people here on the channel at 1080p competitive settings. It's a very similar story. Once again, the cards perform pretty much as you'd expect, although the RX6800 takes a pretty pronounced lead over its higher end rivals. DLSS helps you once again to get the edge on your frame rate and takes you up just about to the next tier of graphics card. So a 3060 Ti with DLSS is basically the performance of a 3070. Tuning up to high settings, and the 6800 takes a phenomenal lead. The 6800 has some quite anomalous results, and I think AMD have got a lot of work to do in a good way optimizing the drivers, because if this consistently performs like this in a load more titles, AMD suddenly become a lot more competitive. Once again, not much in it between the 60 Ti and the 70, and the 3060 performs pretty well, and I'll pop some 3060 gameplay on your screen now as well, so you can see just visually how good this looks. We also tested the likes of Rainbow Six Siege, and we get a really nice sloping upwards pattern here. The 6800 beating out the 3070 by not quite such a large margin as before, and remember, it is at RRP a more expensive card, so we'd expect those kind of results. We also tested the likes of Doom Eternal, and while this game has no ray tracing support, its straight rasterization is a really good test, and it pushes light into the limits, especially when you consider that there's no ray tracing on this card. We see a really nice sloped incline here. 3070 pulls out a phenomenal lead against the 60 Ti. It is a really weird pairing, these two. If you've got the extra cash, probably is the safer bet for better performance across the board, but as I say, it can be quite marginal. The 3060 brings around 40 FPS more than the 2060 from last gen, which is very good, especially considering most 3060 users will be moving from a 960 or even a 1060, right? And once again, the 6800 doesn't really pull out too much of a lead here, sitting exactly where you'd expect. The last game I tested today is actually potentially one of the most interesting from a performance point of view, because it actually supports ray tracing on the AMD card, where some of our other titles today simply don't yet, like Cyberpunk. At 1440p high with no ray tracing first, so we get kind of an even benchmark, and all the cards sit quite close together actually. There's only 30 frames per second between the 3060, this ASUS STRIX card in particular, and actually Nvidia's 3080. The Founders Edition is the card we tested, though you may get a bit more performance with some of the AIB alternatives. The 3060 Ti comes completely level pegging with the 3070. There is not a single frame in it, although when you throw DLSS into the mix, it jumps ahead by 2 frames per second, which is not a lot. I mean, that's sort of margin of error stuff, right? The 6800 is really solid though without ray tracing, and beats out the 3080 without any DLSS support, and DLSS not having much of a difference here, 1 or 2 FPS in some cases. But I think the graph that really tells the whole story, if you like ray tracing, is this one. 72, 81, 94, this is all good. 36. Yes, this is like 65, 70% lower than the 3070, which is cheaper than this card when you use ray tracing, and that's a real shame. Now, to be clear, the Nvidia results did have DLSS, although without DLSS, you're not going to see this dramatic of a drop, right? But the fact AMD have no answer to DLSS means simply we can't test it. Much like their answer to ray tracing is, in my opinion, not yet where it needs to be. Nvidia have got those dedicated second-gen RT cores to help with ray tracing, and to be clear, you know, I think ray tracing is a great addition in games, but I know some of you guys aren't too worried about it. You're not too bothered about it. And if you play in complete straight rasterization games, you're playing the likes of Valorant, you're playing the likes of Apex, although there's an argument to be made for Nvidia Reflex, but that's a whole other video, then the 6800 is possibly not a bad shout. But stock of that is even worse than the rest of the lineup today, so maybe you won't be doing that after all. So, conclusion time. What are the key takeaways from this video? What graphics card should you buy, and which ones should you simply avoid? Well, if you can find any stock of them, they're all fantastic cards. The 6800, despite the disappointing ray tracing and lack of DLSS, is a fantastic GPU for the price point, although as I say, stock is not great. And interestingly, the 3060 Ti comes very, very close to the 3070, and if you're a gamer on a budget, this might be the shout for you. Whether we'll see a 3070 Ti or a Super, I'm sure later down the line, is yet to be clear. But it goes to show that the 60 Ti definitely has an edge over the 3060. It's little brother, but nevertheless, this card performs incredibly well at 1080p 1080, even 1440p, especially at its recommended retail price. And on that note, that pretty much wraps it up for our comparison today and the whole video. Something a bit different. If you like this, give it a big old like rating, get subscribed for more content like this, and build videos from me. Thanks for tuning in though, and as always, we'll see you in the next one. Adios!